The 1940s forged films in the furnace of war. Britain, bombed and weary, turned to cinema not just for escape, but for survival. Stories that reminded people why they endured. Yet many of these films, overshadowed by grander epics, faded into obscurity. Today, we unearth 12 underrated British war dramas of the 1940s that carried truth, grit, and haunting humanity. 1. Convoy, 1940. When Convoy premiered in 1940, Britain was facing the terrifying reality of German U-boat dominance in the Atlantic. Directed by Penn Tennyson, it was one of Ealing Studios' first attempts at dramatizing the war at sea, and while critics at the time regarded it as competent but not spectacular, hindsight reveals a film that captured the fears of a nation in real time. The story centers on HMS Apollo, tasked with escorting a vulnerable group of merchant ships across the Atlantic. On the surface, it is a naval drama filled with moments of suspense, enemy sightings, torpedoes, and sudden death. But beneath that lies a human drama. The Apollo's captain wrestles with duty against compassion when faced with stranded refugees, while tensions simmer among officers weary of endless battles with unseen enemies beneath the waves. What makes Convoy particularly underrated is its willingness to show the psychological weight of war at sea. Instead of glorifying battle, it conveys the monotony, the claustrophobia, and the gnawing dread that sailors endured. At a time when propaganda demanded bold victories and triumphalism, Convoy slipped in moments of unease and human vulnerability. Behind the camera, Tennyson worked closely with the Royal Navy to ensure authenticity. Real naval advisors shaped dialogue and tactics, while Ealing's sets recreated cramped ship interiors with eerie precision. Sadly, Tennyson's promising career ended when he died in a plane crash in 1941, making Convoy one of the few surviving testaments to his talent. Though overshadowed by later naval epics, like In Which We Serve, 1942, Convoy stands as a snapshot of Britain's fragile resilience at the war's outset. Watching it today feels like opening a time capsule of fear and duty, an echo of sailors who sailed into the dark knowing they might never return. 2. Millions Like Us, 1943. While many war films spotlighted soldiers, Millions Like Us turned its gaze toward the home front, giving voice to the civilians whose lives were irrevocably changed by the war. Directed by Sidney Gilliat and Frank Launder, this 1943 film followed Celia Crowson, an ordinary woman conscripted into munitions work. Critics labeled it propaganda, but what they missed was its emotional honesty and quiet revolutionary spirit. The story unfolds as Celia adjusts to factory life, sharing cramped quarters, forging friendships, experiencing romance, and ultimately suffering devastating loss. By focusing on one woman's journey, the film transforms the war effort from a distant abstraction into a deeply personal struggle. Audiences, particularly women, living through similar realities, found their own lives reflected on screen. The production was notable for its authenticity. To capture factory life accurately, the filmmakers brought in real munitions workers to advise on dialogue and routines. Sets were modeled on actual wartime factories, lending the film a documentary quality. These touches ensured the story felt lived in rather than staged. The legacy of Millions Like Us lies in its subtle acknowledgement of social change. It depicted women stepping into traditionally male-dominated roles, proving their strength, resilience, and indispensability. At a time when women were expected to quietly retreat after the war, the film hinted at a new Britain being forged in those factories, one where gender roles could never fully return to what they once were. Though largely forgotten today, Millions Like Us stands as a moving reminder that war was not fought only in trenches or cockpits. It was also fought in sweat-drenched workshops, in shared dormitories, and in the hearts of millions of ordinary people who carried Britain through its darkest hours. 3. San Demetrio, London, 1943. San Demetrio, London dramatizes one of the most astonishing survival stories of World War II. In November 1940, the British oil tanker San Demetrio was torpedoed in the Atlantic. Its crew abandoned ship, but a small group returned to the flaming wreck and, against all odds, managed to sail the burning vessel back to Britain. This true story became the backbone of Charles Friend's gripping 1943 film. Unlike typical naval dramas that emphasized command structure or large-scale battles, San Demetrio London celebrated ordinary seamen, engineers, stokers, deckhands, men without medals or fanfare. Their fight wasn't against a visible enemy, but against fire, salt water, failing engines, and their own exhaustion. What unfolds is less spectacle than testament, the sheer willpower of humans refusing to surrender. The film's production demanded equal endurance. Ealing Studios went to great lengths to replicate the tanker's ordeal. Sets were deliberately flooded to recreate the chaos of waterlogged compartments, and technical consultants from the real San Demetrio advised on details like oil fires and shipboard repairs. The realism is striking. You feel every clang of the engine room, every swell of the Atlantic. Audiences in 1943 found inspiration in its tale of perseverance, but the film gradually slipped from prominence after the war. Critics today admire its restraint, eschewing melodrama for understated realism. There are no soaring speeches or triumphant scores, just a steady march of struggle and survival. In its quiet way, San Demetrio London mirrored Britain itself during the war, battered, aflame, yet determined to endure. It is an underrated classic because it tells the story of anonymous heroes whose courage kept a nation alive. Watching it now, one feels the humbling reminder that history was not made only by generals, but by ordinary men who refused to let their ship sink. 4. The Flemish Farm, 1943. When The Flemish Farm was released in 1943, it carried the weight of a true story. Produced by Ealing Studios, the film dramatized the mission of Belgian Air Force officers who risked everything to recover their regimental colors from Nazi-occupied Belgium. On paper, the plot might sound simple, a group of men sneaking across enemy lines to reclaim a flag, but in execution, it becomes a story of duty, identity, and sacrifice. The film opens with Belgium defeated, its military shattered. Yet for these airmen, the loss of their colors symbolized dishonor. To restore pride, they embarked on a dangerous mission back into their homeland. What follows is less a conventional war drama than a meditation on patriotism. These men risked certain death not for victory in battle, but for the preservation of their nation's spirit. Behind the scenes, Ealing consulted real Belgian officers who had lived through the ordeal. This gave the production unusual authenticity. Locations were carefully chosen to evoke the occupied landscapes of Europe, and while censorship demanded a degree of optimism, the script carries a haunting undercurrent of despair. It suggests that victory, even if achieved, would always come at staggering cost. Critics at the time admired the film's noble intentions but dismissed it as overly stiff. Yet today, that very restraint makes it powerful. It avoids melodrama, focusing instead on the quiet dignity of men determined to honor their country, even in exile. The Flemish Farm may not have the bombast of other wartime dramas, but its understated patriotism and moral gravity make it one of the era's most movingly underrated films. 5. Western Approaches, 1944. Few films of the 1940s feel as unique or as forgotten as Pat Jackson's Western Approaches. Shot in color at a time when British films rarely could afford such extravagance, it is both a propaganda piece and a cinematic experiment, blending documentary realism with scripted drama. The result is an extraordinary portrait of life and death at sea. The film follows sailors of a torpedoed merchant ship struggling to survive in lifeboats, all while enemy submarines stalk nearby. But what sets Western Approaches apart is how it was made. Jackson cast real merchant seamen instead of actors, giving the performances raw authenticity. Their awkward line deliveries only heighten the sense that we're watching real men, not polished stars, endure the agony of survival. Filming was equally dangerous. Crews worked in open seas under hazardous conditions, and the production used genuine naval vessels and aircraft. The Technicolor photography captures the Atlantic in hues both breathtaking and unforgiving, shimmering waves at dawn, storm-lashed decks, and the vast, indifferent ocean stretching endlessly around tiny lifeboats. Though praised at the time for its visual boldness, Western approaches quickly faded into obscurity, perhaps because its hybrid of documentary and drama didn't fit comfortably into post-war cinema. Yet revisiting it today reveals an extraordinary achievement. Its images are hauntingly poetic, its perspective brutally human. It is less about battle than about endurance, less about victory than about survival in the indifferent face of nature and war. In the lineage of British war cinema, Western approaches deserves far greater recognition, not just as propaganda, but as a daring experiment that captured the peril of seafaring men with unparalleled immediacy. 6. Fires Were Started, 1943. Directed by Humphrey Jennings, Fires Were Started stands as one of the most innovative and moving British films of the war era. It is not a conventional drama at all, but rather a docudrama, blurring the line between staged narrative and lived reality. Jennings, a master of poetic realism, set out to tell the story of Britain's auxiliary fire service during the Blitz. What he created was something between documentary and art. The film follows firemen racing through bombed streets, dousing infernos, and saving lives amidst collapsing buildings. But instead of professional actors, Jennings cast real firemen who reenacted scenes drawn from their own experiences. This choice gave the film an extraordinary authenticity. Their hesitant delivery is outweighed by the sheer truth in their movements, the way they handle hoses, climb ladders, and steel themselves against collapsing structures. Shot in a style that borders on the lyrical, Fires Were Started elevates mundane labor into something almost mythic. Jennings was fascinated by the poetry of everyday life, and in this film, a man carrying a hose through rubble becomes as heroic as any soldier storming a trench. There are no grand speeches, no cinematic flourishes of triumph. Instead, there is camaraderie, sweat, and courage under unrelenting fire. Though contemporary audiences respected its artistry, the film was sometimes dismissed as too artistic to be practical propaganda. Yet today, its blending of realism and lyricism feels revolutionary. It captures not just what happened during the Blitz, but what it felt like, the terror of collapsing buildings, the exhaustion of endless nights, the fragile resilience of ordinary people. Fires Were Started is not simply a war film. It is a portrait of a nation holding itself together through fire, rubble, and sheer willpower. Underrated in its day, it now stands as one of the boldest artistic experiments to emerge from wartime Britain. 7. The Lamp Still Burns, 1943. Not every war drama focused on soldiers, sailors, or bombers. Some turned their gaze to those who kept Britain alive on the home front. The Lamp Still Burns, directed by Maurice Elvey, is one such film. Overshadowed by more famous wartime dramas, it remains an underrated exploration of nurses, unsung heroes who faced their own battlefield within hospital walls. The story follows Hilary Clark, a trained architect who gives up her career to become a nurse during the war. While this may seem like propaganda designed to boost recruitment, the film digs deeper. It highlights the exhaustion of long shifts, the emotional toll of treating grievously wounded soldiers, and the personal sacrifices nurses made in silence. Romance is woven into the narrative, but never at the expense of realism. Behind the camera, Elvey took inspiration from A.J. Cronin's novel The Lamp Still Burns, itself based on true nursing experiences. The production sought to honor the profession while exposing the lack of resources, overcrowded wards, and relentless pace of wartime hospitals. It is less a tale of triumph than of resilience. women battling bureaucracy, illness, and fatigue while keeping their lamps burning through the darkest nights. At the time, critics acknowledged its sincerity, but dismissed it as overly earnest compared to more heroic war films. Yet in hindsight, that focus on ordinary endurance is its greatest strength. Unlike stories of soldiers who fought for a nation's survival, The Lamp Still Burns reminds us of those who fought for individual lives, one broken body at a time. It remains underrated because it dared to suggest that heroism is not always found on the battlefield, but also in hospital wards where nurses stood between chaos and hope. 8. The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, 1943. Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger's The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp is often hailed by critics today as one of Britain's greatest films, but in its own time it was controversial, misunderstood, and largely underappreciated. Released in the middle of the war, its satirical yet compassionate look at Britain's military traditions clashed with official expectations. Winston Churchill himself reportedly tried to suppress it, fearing its nuanced portrayal of an aging officer would harm morale. The film spans decades, following Clive Candy, a soldier whose sense of honor and chivalry becomes increasingly outdated in the brutal modern world. By the 1940s, his Victorian ideals no longer match the ruthless reality of Nazi warfare. Yet rather than mocking him, the film treats Candy with profound humanity, showing how war erodes not only cities and lives, but values themselves. Shot in rich Technicolor, the film defied wartime austerity. Pressburger's script interwove satire with deep emotional resonance, and Anton Walbrook's performance as a German officer offered a rare sympathetic depiction of the enemy. This was almost unheard of in wartime Britain, where propaganda demanded stark divisions of good and evil. Critics of the time found it confusing and even subversive. Some audiences dismissed it as too long, too philosophical, too soft on Germany. Only decades later was it reevaluated as a masterpiece. Yet in 1943, it was underrated, lost amid the demand for rousing patriotic stories. Today, Colonel Blimp feels prophetic. It speaks to the evolution of warfare, the loss of innocence, and the enduring humanity that persists even across enemy lines. Its undervalued status in its time makes it a perfect inclusion in this list, a misunderstood gem that only history could properly appreciate. 9. The Silent Village, 1943. The Silent Village is one of the boldest and most haunting wartime films produced in Britain, yet it is often overlooked. Directed by Humphrey Jennings, the film retells the story of the Czech village of Liditz, which was destroyed by the Nazis after the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. But instead of recreating the event with actors and foreign locations, Jennings did something extraordinary. He transposed the story to a small Welsh mining village. Using non-professional actors, the villagers themselves, Jennings recreated the occupation, reprisals, and destruction as though it had happened in Wales. The result is a chilling allegory. By showing ordinary British miners subjected to Nazi terror, Jennings made foreign atrocities visceral and immediate for British audiences. The message was simple but powerful. This could happen here. The production was as daring as its concept. Jennings filmed in CWM South Wales, working with locals who lent authenticity to every scene. Their natural, unaffected performances blurred the line between fiction and reality. Critics noted its eerie realism, with miners trudging to work under the gaze of Nazi patrols as if it were a documentary. Though praised in some circles, the film remained little known, perhaps because it was too unsettling. While other films offered morale-boosting triumphs, The Silent Village forced viewers to confront the brutality of occupation and the fragility of freedom. It was propaganda, yes, but it was also art, a meditation on violence, resilience, and community. Today, it remains one of Jennings' most daring experiments, a film that resonates beyond its time. Underrated upon release, it lingers as a poetic warning. Freedom is never guaranteed, and even the quietest villages can be silenced by tyranny. 10. The Way Ahead, 1944. When The Way Ahead premiered in 1944, audiences already knew the war's toll was immense. Yet here was a film that reminded them why ordinary men fought and how war transformed them. Directed by Carol Reed and scripted by Eric Ambler with a young Peter Ustinov, it is a deeply human portrait of civilians learning to become soldiers. The story begins with a group of conscripts, shopkeepers, clerks, farmers, thrust into military service. They stumble through drills, gripe about discipline, and struggle to find common ground. But slowly, through hardship and shared trials, they forge unity. By the film's end, they are no longer disparate individuals, but a battalion ready to fight together in North Africa. At the time, audiences embraced the film for its humor, heart, and sense of truth. Unlike stiff propaganda, it showed soldiers as flawed, bickering, and often reluctant, yet capable of courage. The characters, played by actors like David Niven and Stanley Holloway, felt authentic, embodying the men who had just been pulled from Britain's factories, shops, and farms. Behind the scenes, Carol Reed's direction gave the film a documentary-like realism. He used long sequences of training exercises, detailed attention to barracks life, and natural dialogue to capture the rhythm of soldiering. Real military advisors ensured accuracy, but Reed balanced that with warmth and wit, making the characters relatable. Though admired in its day, The Way Ahead was eventually overshadowed by bigger, more epic war films. Yet its strength lies in intimacy. It is not about grand battles, but about transformation, the journey from civilian to soldier, from doubt to duty. In its quiet way, it honors the millions who walk that same path, making it one of the most underrated British war dramas of the 1940s. 11. The Small Back Room, 1949. Though technically released at the end of the decade, The Small Back Room is too essential to ignore. Directed by Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, it is a war film unlike any other. A tense psychological thriller about the quiet, hidden battles waged behind the front lines. Overshadowed by their more flamboyant films, it remains one of the duo's most underrated works. The film follows Sammy Rice, a crippled bomb disposal expert battling personal demons, alcoholism, self-doubt, and bitterness, while confronting the life-and-death task of defusing German booby-trap bombs. Played with tortured intensity by David Farrar, Rice is no glamorous hero. He is broken, fragile, yet forced to muster courage in the shadows, where one mistake could mean instant death. The production was as daring as its subject. Powell and Pressburger used stark lighting and claustrophobic sets to reflect Rice's psychological turmoil. In one memorable sequence, his confrontation with a ticking bomb on a windswept beach becomes an allegory for the entire war effort, the nation itself standing on a knife's edge, one wrong move away from disaster. Critics at the time respected the film but found it too bleak, too unorthodox. Audiences wanted triumphant narratives. Instead, The Small Back Room offered a study of despair and resilience. Only decades later was it reevaluated as a masterpiece of psychological realism. Its underrated status stems from its refusal to flatter. It shows that war was not only fought with tanks and planes, but also in small back rooms, where scientists, engineers, and lonely men carried burdens invisible to the public. It remains a haunting reminder that the quietest battles often left the deepest scars. 12. In Which We Serve, 1942. It is almost ironic to call In Which We Serve underrated, given its success at the time, but in the modern canon of war cinema, it has slipped from the spotlight it deserves. Directed by Noel Coward and David Lean, this semi-documentary epic told the story of the Royal Navy through the sinking of HMS Turin. It was praised for its patriotism, but what makes it underrated today is how deeply it captured the collective spirit of wartime Britain. Coward, who also starred as Captain Kinross, based the story loosely on the loss of HMS Kelly, a destroyer he knew personally. The film alternates between tense battle sequences and flashbacks to the sailors' lives at home, wives, children, and quiet moments that made their sacrifice more poignant. It was one of the first films to portray the war not just as military duty, but as a shared struggle between those at sea and those waiting anxiously at home. Behind the camera, the production marked the debut of David Lean, who would later become one of Britain's greatest directors. His talent is already visible here in sweeping battle scenes and tender domestic interludes. The Royal Navy cooperated extensively, lending ships and technical advice to ensure authenticity. Contemporary audiences embraced it, yet over time it became overshadowed by flashier post-war films and American epics. Today, it deserves recognition not just as propaganda, but as one of the most sincere and moving depictions of camaraderie, loss, and endurance. In Which We Serve is underrated because it captured something ephemeral, the spirit of unity, sacrifice, and resilience that defined Britain during its darkest hour. It was not just about one ship, but about a nation adrift in stormy seas, determined to survive. These films remind us that war was not only fought with guns and planes, but also with courage, sacrifice, and resilience etched into quiet lives. Forgotten by history, they still burn with truth. Which of these underrated treasures spoke to you most? Like, subscribe, and share your own wartime favorites below.